There was a time when disagreement did not automatically mean distrust. Americans could disagree about taxes, immigration, trade, war, even the direction of the country, and still believe there were certain things that existed beyond politics. An election result, a court ruling, an economic statistic, an intelligence assessment, a documented fact. But increasingly, I wonder whether we are losing that distinction. Because a crisis of trust does not begin simply when people disagree. It begins when people no longer know what standard of truth they're being asked to use. And lately, when I compare some of what Americans are being told with the public record available to us, I keep coming back to one question. Who are we supposed to believe? Perhaps nowhere is that question more consequential than our elections. Donald Trump won in 2016. But even after winning, he claimed millions of people had voted illegally and that those votes explained his loss of the popular vote. His administration created the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Less than a year later, that commission was dissolved without producing a final report substantiating the specific claim that millions of illegal votes had cost him the popular vote. Then came 2020. Trump lost. And this time, the allegations became much more serious. The election was stolen. Voting machines were questioned. Ballots were challenged. Lawsuits followed. But election security officials working within Trump's own administration called the November 2020 election the most secure in American history and said there was no evidence voting systems had deleted votes, lost votes, or changed votes. And then there's Georgia. They counted the ballots. Then they counted them again. A statewide hand audit confirmed Biden's victory. A Trump-requested recount confirmed it again. A subsequent signatured audit found no fraudulent absentee ballots in the country examined. The challenges went to court as well, and I want to be careful here. You've probably heard people say that Trump simply lost 60 fraud cases. That is an oversimplification. Some cases failed procedurally. Some involved standing. Others involve substantive legal arguments. But after all that litigation, no case produced evidence capable of reversing the presidential result. Then came 2024, and Trump won. 312 electoral votes for Trump to Kamala Harris's 226. And Georgia audited again. This time, the audits confirmed Trump as the winner. So here's my question. If the same election systems can be trusted when they produce the winner we want, but become suspect when they don't, what exactly is our standard? because democracy cannot function indefinitely if every election has only two possible outcomes. We won, or they cheated. But elections are something Americans can even audit. War is different. Most of us don't have access to classified intelligence. We do not sit inside diplomatic negotiations. We have to rely upon what our leaders tell us. And that's where Iran becomes important.
And most importantly, we have a deal that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, which was the whole purpose of what we had to go through to get this. So it was a big, very big thing. But we have a signing soon, and the documents are in pretty final shape. So we'll see. We'll see. Very good. Should be done, and it should be done pretty quickly. They want it every bit as much as everybody else wants it. And I think a lot of good relationships can ensue from this.
That's a very definitive statement. But listen to what followed.
They have, and again, as you know, no Navy, no Air Force, no anti-aircraft, no radar, no nothing. I mean, and we, as you know, we just reinstituted the I guess you could go, I call it the iron wall on the water. Nothing gets through. Nothing. Blockade. Nothing gets through. And they sort of have to make a deal. But we are talking to them. I think they're being serious. I think they are being by far the most serious that we've seen them. But that doesn't mean we get there. We'll see what happens. But I always prefer that alternative.
Iranian officials publicly disputed the report that negotiations were taking place. And perhaps some of what we're hearing is negotiating strategy. That's possible. Governments communicate privately through mediators all the time. One government may call those communications talks, while another refuses to characterize them that way. But when we're talking about war, citizens are being asked to trust information they often cannot independently verify until much later. That puts an extraordinary responsibility on leadership. Words must mean something. And negotiations are not the only question. After American strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, President Trump described those facilities as obliterated. But America's own intelligence assessment required more nuance. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard told Congress that the intelligence community continued to assess that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, and that its supreme leader had not authorized the weapons program suspended in 2003. At the same time, she warned that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile had reached unprecedented levels for a country without nuclear weapons. And both facts can be true. Iran can pose a serious nuclear proliferation risk without currently building a nuclear weapon. Its enrichment program can be deeply concerning without every political description of its capabilities being equally precise.
Yesterday you said to Reuters that we're dealing with who is in charge now. What changed from yesterday to today?
Nothing. It's just that they gave us a paper that should have been better. And interestingly, immediately when I canceled it, within 10 minutes we got a new paper that was much better.
What was on that paper, sir?
We talked about they will not have a nuclear weapon. It's very simple. Look, that whole deal is not complicated. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Very simple.
And that is the distinction we have to preserve. Concern is not the problem. Taking Iran seriously is not the problem. But when we are dealing with war in nuclear weapons, precision matters. Because the consequences of getting it wrong are not measured in polling points. They are measured in human lives. But some government claims can be tested because the numbers are public. Take Canada, for example. The administration justified emergency tariffs against Canada around the flow of illicit drugs, including fentanyl, across America's northern border. So, I went looking for the numbers. The Congressional Research Service provides the documented scale of fentanyl seizures associated with the Canadian and Mexican borders. And the northern border amount represented only a tiny fraction of overall seizures. Now, let me be clear. Fentanyl crossing from Canada is not nothing. Fentanyl kills people. Governments have every responsibility to secure their borders. But when something is used to justify extraordinary economic action against one of America's closest allies, we should be allowed to ask, does the rhetoric match the documented scale of the problem? Because Canada is not simply another foreign trading partner. Canada and the United States share one of the world's largest bilateral trading relationships. Canada supplies America with enormous quantities of energy. Crude oil, natural gas, electricity, and then there's something most Americans probably don't spend much time thinking about: potash. America depends heavily upon imports of potash, and Canada is overwhelmingly its largest foreign supplier. Potash becomes fertilizer. Fertilizer becomes food. This is what an integrated continental economy looks like. Then there's USMCA. This was not an agreement Donald Trump inherited. It was his agreement. Trump once praised it as the largest, fairest, most balanced, and modern trade agreement ever achieved. And then the relationship changed.
I called him Governor Trudeau because they should be the 51st state, really. It would make a great state. And the people of Canada like it. They'd pay lower taxes. They have virtual...
Trade disputes between allies are normal. Renegotiating agreements is legitimate. But sovereignty is different. When Canadians hear an American president repeatedly talking about their country becoming an American state, they don't necessarily hear a negotiating tactic. They hear a threat to their country. And allies remember those things. Because trust between nations, just like trust between people, can take decades to build and minutes to damage. And that brings us directly to the tariffs themselves. Americans have repeatedly heard tariffs described as money foreign countries pay America. But legally, that's not how tariff collection works. The importer pays the duty to U.S. Customs. And economically, some of that cost can transfer further down the chain. Federal Reserve research found measurable increases in retail prices attributable to tariff exposure. Another Federal Reserve study found households paying more and buying less. Suppose an importer paid a tariff. Suppose some of that cost was passed along through higher prices. Then the tariff is invalidated and the importer receives a refund. What happens to the customer who already paid the higher price? Now, that does not mean tariffs are always bad. They can protect strategic industries, counter unfair trade practices, reshape supply chains, provide negotiating leverage. But Americans deserve to know honestly who may bear the cost. And then something remarkable happened. The Supreme Court ruled against the statutory authority used for the tariff at issue. Refunds followed. Approximately 100 billion, with a B, 100 billion in tariff refunds had already been processed, while disputes continued over which importers were entitled to refunds. And that's why the question I just asked matters. Legally, the importer paid the government, so the importer receives refund. But economically, the consumer can't just walk back into the store 6 months later with a receipt and say, "I'd like my portion of that tariff back, please." This is not an accusation of wrongdoing by the importer. It is a consequence of how tariffs move through an economy. And that is why understanding who actually bear the cost matters before economic policy is implemented, not after. Economic arguments are notoriously easy to manipulate because almost everyone can find a statistic supporting the story they want to tell. GDP can rise while a family struggles. Markets can soar while people cannot afford homes. Unemployment can remain relatively low while workers worry about their next job. Inflation can fall while prices remain painfully higher than they were several years ago. All of those things can be true at the same time. Maybe the economic statistics are not false. Maybe the problem is that we've become too comfortable selecting whichever statistic tells the story we want told. Markets matters. GDP matters. Employment matters. But purchasing power matters. And debt matters. Confidence matters. And whether ordinary families believe they're moving forward also matters. Wall Street is part of America, but it is not all of America. And that is why we need to look at more than one number. America is not an economic wasteland. The economy continues to grow. The labor market is not simply collapsing either. Those facts matter. But then look at households. What happens to wages after inflation matters more to families than the nominal number on a paycheck. Household debt is measured in the trillions. Delinquencies matters. And Americans themselves are expressing uncertainty about their finances and economic future. Then let's compare America internationally. This is the OECD's G7 inflation assessment. At points in 2026, American inflation was running above its G7 peers. That does not mean Canada or Germany or Japan has a better economy than America. Inflation alone cannot establish that. But it does mean Americans are entitled to ask whether a declaration of extraordinary economic strength tells the whole story. Because the economy Americans hear about and the economy Americans actually live in should eventually resemble one another. And then there's Jeffrey Epstein. I almost left this out because there is so much speculation surrounding Epstein that separating documented fact from internet mythology can be difficult. But that is precisely why it belongs in a conversation about trust. During the 2024 campaign, Trump was asked whether he would release Epstein-related material. Listen carefully to his answer.
Conspiracy theorist. So if you were president, would you declassify, you can answer yes or no to these, would you declassify the 9/11 files?
Yeah.
Would you declassify JFK files?
Yeah.
Would you,
I did a lot of it.
Would you declassify the Epstein files?
Yeah, I would.
And that qualification matters. Trump indicated he would release material, but also expressed concern about releasing false information that could harm innocent people. Then came July 2025. The Justice Department and the FBI said their review found no incriminating client list, no credible evidence that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals, and no evidence that justified investigating uncharged third parties. They concluded that further disclosure was not warranted. But then, Congress passed the Epstein File Transparency Act. President Trump signed it. The law required broad disclosure and specifically said records could not simply be withheld because of embarrassment, reputational damage, or political sensitivity. Then, in January 2026, the DOJ announced that nearly 3.5 million pages had been released. So the responsible question is not, why won't they release the Epstein file? They have released millions of pages. And appearing in an Epstein document does not establish that somebody committed a crime. The more interesting question is, how did we get from expectations of disclosure to the Justice Department saying further disclosure was not warranted, to Congress passing a law requiring disclosure, to millions of pages ultimately being released? Maybe there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every stage. But when government communication keeps changing on a subject already saturated with suspicion, the government should not be surprised when public trust suffers. Now, none of what I've shown you proves that everything Donald Trump says is false. This is not my conclusion. Some claims we've examined are supported. Some are partly supported. Some require context. Some collide with other evidence. And some involved events moving so quickly that what was true yesterday may genuinely be different tomorrow. But that is exactly why this conversation matters. Because somewhere along the way, we started treating skepticism as betrayal. Question a Republican and you're a Democrat. Question a Democrat and you're MAGA. Question military action and you're weak. Question an election, you're dangerous. Defend an election result, you're part of the establishment. There has to be another way. We should be able to question leaders without hating them. We should be able to support a president and still demand evidence from him. We should be able to acknowledge when someone we supported was right and when the record suggests he was wrong. And we should apply exactly the same standard to the people we oppose. That is not disloyalty. That is citizenship. I don't want a government that simply tells me what I want to hear. I want a government I can believe when it tells me something I don't want to hear. Because that's the truest test of credibility. The next crisis will come. A president may ask us to support military action. A government may declare an emergency. An election may be challenged. A financial crisis may require sacrifice. And in those moments, we may not have weeks to investigate. We may have hours, sometimes minutes. That is when trust becomes national infrastructure. And once destroyed, it cannot simply be ordered back into existence. So, who should we trust? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe trust should not be permanently handed to one politician, a political party, a television network, or even an institution. Maybe trust should be earned continuously. Check the claim, read the document, look at the numbers, listen to the entire statement, not just the 10-second clip. Distinguish allegation from evidence, distinguish disagreement from deception. And when new evidence proves something you believed was wrong, then change your mind. Because changing your mind is not weakness, it's discernment. And for Christians, discernment should never be optional. Political loyalty cannot replace our responsibility to seek truth, and neither can political hatred. Our allegiance to truth has to survive both. So don't just take my word for what you've heard today. Every topic I bring you has been thoroughly researched. But even then, check me too. Read the decisions. Look at the government reports. Watch the original clips. Examine the economic data. Compare what was said then with what we know now. Because perhaps the way out of America's crisis of trust is not learning to trust politicians more. Perhaps it begins with citizens becoming harder to deceive and humble enough to correct themselves when the evidence demands it. Trust should never require blindness. Leadership should never fear scrutiny. And truth should never depend on who won the election. Stand firm in your faith and protect your freedom. Now, go ahead and subscribe. You already know you're coming back. This is the Emma Effect. See you soon.